Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with a walk through the first lesson in our Greek Reading 1 course in which we study the Gospel of St. John. You can see on the screen here that the topic for this first lesson is the Gospel of St. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And if you've studied Latin with us in the Academy, we follow the same exact process that we use to study Latin in reading the Gospel of St. John to get started. But we're going to be reading Greek in this course, and as always, the greatest obstacle to the study of classical Greek or biblical Greek is the alphabet. So if you're not familiar with the alphabet and aren't able to read the letters yet, there are some videos in our Greek reading course at the beginning that walk you through the alphabet and help with pronunciation and accents and breathing marks and all that stuff. So you might want to start there if this is the first video you've seen. Again, this is the beginning of the Greek Reading 1 course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, but in this video we're going to go ahead and get started with the reading of these first 5 verses from the Gospel of St. John. So the way we work through these lessons is we start by reading the text. We take 5 verses in each lesson. We read through the text, and in our first reading we simply want to become familiar with what we're going to be studying. We want to make sure we study the words and even the letters and all of the symbols carefully to make sure we practice good Greek pronunciation. And then we work through the translation word by word through each verse we study. And as I said, we work through about 5 verses in every lesson. So let's go ahead and get started here rather than waste any time. And again, this is the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 in Greek. And you see here at the top of the lesson, we have our text for verses 1 through 5. So let's just take a look at this text and read through it together. And I ask that you pay attention and follow along. I'll mark where I'm at with my cursor so you can follow. But make sure you pay attention to all of the letters in the Greek, all of the marks that identify breathing symbols, accents, and some other points of grammar that I'll comment on as we get started here, because we don't talk about these things in Latin, and so I'd like to use the time and opportunity to make sure this is all clear as we get started in Greek studies. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll work slowly through this first lesson, and then we'll speed up in future lessons as we go along. So let's read verse 1 together here. You can see the text of verse 1. This first word is en. You see it's got a soft breathing mark, a soft breathing mark. So we just start with the sound of the epsilon, e, and then the second letter here is the Greek consonant nu. So we read that first word as en, en. The second word here, we see the alpha with a soft breathing, or really no aspiration above it. So we're just going to read it as a. The second letter is the Greek consonant rho. And then we've got the Greek consonant chi, or chi, as it's said in modern English. And then we've got the Greek vowel eta. You see underneath this vowel eta, we see a small iota that's called the iota subscript, the small iota written under the vowel. And above the vowel, we have a tilde. In English, we refer to it as a tilde, but this is used to mark what's called the circumflex accent in Greek. And the circumflex accent is pronounced with a rise and a fall of pitch on that vowel or diphthong. So the first word we saw is en. The second word we have here is arche, arche, arche. Notice that iota subscript is not pronounced. We just read that eta with a rise and fall of pitch on that vowel. En arche, arche. The next word we again see the eta. We have a soft breathing or no aspiration mark above it. And we see another tilde, another circumflex accent. So we're going to pronounce this third word as ein, ein, ein. You can hear that rise and fall in pitch on that vowel because of the circumflex accent. Ein, ein. And that second letter there is the consonant nu, which we saw in the first word. Now, compare these two words. Compare en, which starts with the epsilon, which is a short e sound. Compare that with this third word, which starts with the eta, which is a longer e sound. Ein, ein. So it's good to compare those two words and make sure your pronunciation is clear enough and careful enough that you can hear the difference in those two words. The next part of speech we have here, we have the omicron, and above it we have our first rough breathing mark, or first aspiration mark. So that aspiration mark, or rough breathing, is equivalent to the English consonant H. So it's as if there's a letter H before this vowel. The omicron is pronounced with a short O sound, like O, O, O. So to read this word here, we have the rough breathing mark, the aspiration mark, followed by the vowel omicron. We read this as ho, ho, ho. En, arche, ein, ho. The next word we have here, we have lambda, and then omicron with an acute accent above it, so the pitch is going to rise as we read that vowel, that first syllable. We have the lambda, the omicron, then we have a gamma, pronounced like a hard English G, 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 and then we have another omicron. And then at the end here, we have what's called the final sigma, the Greek letter sigma, but in its form that's found at the end of words. We'll see in other words. Let me see if I can find one real quick. Let's see if we have a sigma someplace else in a word. Here we have one over here. In verse 5, you can see the regular sigma, which looks like a letter O with a hat on top. We have the sigma there. But here in this word here, we have the final sigma written at the end of the word. So when we put these letters together, we have logos, logos, logos. En arche, ein, ho, logos. We're actually here, sorry. En arche, ein, ho, logos. The next word we have kappa, which is like the English letter K, followed by alpha and iota. These two letters here, alpha and iota, form a diphthong. So even though there's two vowels, they're read with one syllable. So the word kai, kai, has one syllable. You'll notice that above that iota, the second vowel of the diphthong, we've got an accent mark that goes in the opposite direction as the accent we saw in logos. We see it's just a downward accent mark. That's called a grave accent. And we simply lower the pitch a little bit, or simply ignore it. It doesn't really matter. So we read en arche, ein, pay attention to those circumflex accents, en arche, ein, ho, logos, kai, kai. Ho, logos, we see that again, just as we saw before. Ho, logos, ho, logos. Then we see the verb ein again, just like we saw earlier. Ein, ho, logos, ein. The next word begins with the letter P, or pi, as it's normally pronounced in modern English. P, followed by the ro, ro, just like we saw in arche, the ro. We have P, ro, then an omicron with a grave accent, followed by final sigma. Final sigma. This is the preposition pros, pros, pros. We then have the consonant tau, which is like the English T, followed by an omicron with a grave accent, and the letter nu, the consonant nu, which we've seen a couple times. Make sure you don't get nu confused with an English V. There's no V in Greek, so remember that the letter that looks like an English V is actually the Greek consonant nu, which makes the sound n. So this word here is pronounced ton, ton, ton. Then we have the consonant theta, theta, or theta, theta. The letter, what it really signifies or represents is the sound of the TH in Thomas. Thomas. If you hear that T sound with the breath, with the aspiration, Thomas. That's how you should think of this letter theta, but it's so popular to hear it pronounced as theta and read with the English TH like theater, that normally I just encourage students to read it in that way, because it takes too much attention in the beginning to read it with the TH of Thomas. But if you want to be perfect, say it with the TH of Thomas. We then have epsilon, omicron with an acute accent. You see, so the pitch is going to rise on that second vowel, that second syllable, and it ends with the consonant nu. So we have theon, theon, and you hear how that accent, the pitch picks up, theon, theon. So this first phrase here, or the first two phrases, we have en arche ein ho logos, kai ho logos ein pros ton theon. Make sure you pay attention to those accents. Theon. We then have the word kai again. Kai. Remember, one syllable because alpha iota makes a diphthong. So that's one syllable. Kai. Then we have theos. Theos. You can see theon and theos, two different cases or forms of the same noun. Theos. We then have ein again. Ho logos. So we're repeating words already. Ein ho logos. And that's the end of verse 1. In verse 2, we start with a diphthong, omicron upsilon. Omicron upsilon, a diphthong. So these are two vowels that are going to be read as one syllable. Omicron upsilon. We see that there's a rough breathing mark or aspiration mark above the upsilon. So we're going to add the English consonant H before this diphthong. And we see a circumflex accent. So the pitch is going to rise and fall on this diphthong, on this syllable. So we're going to read that as hu-tos, hu. So you hear the consonant sound or the breath of the H before the diphthong, then the rise and the fall in pitch. Hu. And the second half of that word is tos, hu-tos. We then have ein again. We then have en again, which is the same word as we saw at the beginning of the sentence, except it began with an uppercase epsilon, and now we see the lowercase epsilon. So hu-tos, ein, en, and we have arche again. Arche, pros, ton, theon. So this sentence here we have hu-tos, which is new, and then all the other words are being repeated. We've already learned them. Hu-tos, ein, en arche, pros, ton, theon. Verse 3. We have the consonant P followed by an alpha with an acute accent. So we're going to raise pitch on that syllable. We then have the consonant nu, the consonant tau, and the alpha. So panta, panta, panta. Next we have the delta and iota followed by an apostrophe. This is not a breathing mark. This is an apostrophe because this word here is actually dia, a preposition, but the alpha has been dropped and replaced by this apostrophe here. So instead of dia, we just have D. And the reason why that apostrophe is there is because the next word begins with an alpha. So rather than trying to repeat the alpha, they simply drop it and mark it with an apostrophe for the sake of what's called euphony, or for sounding nicely, pleasant sounding speech. So dia is abbreviated to D, and then we have alpha upsilon, which forms another diphthong. So even though we have two vowels, we're going to read them as one syllable. Alpha upsilon with no breathing. You see the soft breathing mark. So we're going to read that as ow, ow, ow. One syllable, no rough breathing. Ow, ow. We then have the consonant tau followed by another diphthong, omicron upsilon, with a circumflex accent over that upsilon. So we're going to read this word as au tu, au tu, au tu. We then have epsilon in the next word with no aspiration, so just e, and then we have gamma and another epsilon with an acute accent, and then we have the letter nu, epsilon, tau, and omicron. So this word here is read as ege, egeneto, egeneto, egeneto. Panta di autu egeneto. We then have kai again. We then have the word choris. Choris. You see the letter ki or kai. It's pronounced like the hard CH in chorus. Chorus. So we have the letter ki. Then we have the vowel omega. Omega, which is a long O. So we have omicron, which means small o, and omega, which means great or large O. We have the omega, ko, ko, ko. We then have ro, iota with a grave accent, and final sigma. Choris, choris, choris. We then have autu again, autu. We then have egeneto, egeneto, which we've already seen. Then we have the diphthong omicron upsilon, again with no breathing, so u, delta, and epsilon, ude, ude, and you see the grave accent mark there, ude. Then this next word, it looks just like n. We saw n up here. We have epsilon and nu, but there's an important difference. There's an important difference in this word because you'll notice it's got a rough breathing mark over that epsilon. So it's not n, it's hen, hen. So we add aspiration before that vowel sound. Hen, hen. We then have the omicron with rough breathing. So we have hen, ha. Hen, ha. And then we have gegonen, once again, gegonen. So verse 3 reads, Panta di autu egeneto, kai choris autu egeneto, ude hen ha gegonen. Verse 4, we now have n again. So again, make sure you distinguish between n and hen over here. Hen with rough breathing and n with no rough breathing. N, then we have the diphthong alpha upsilon with soft breathing, no rough breathing, so au. We then have the consonant tau. We then have the omega with an iota subscript. So we saw iota subscript in this second word, arche. Iota subscript under the eta. Here we see iota subscript under the omega, and we just ignore it in pronunciation. We also see that there's a circumflex accent above the omega, so we have auto, auto, en auto. This letter here is the Greek zeta, like the English z, zeta. We then have the omega and the eta with grave accent, so it's going to come down a bit. Zoe, zoe, zoe. We then have the verb ein again. We then have the conjunction kai. We have the article eta with rough breathing. Notice the rough breathing mark, so we read this as he, he. We then have zoe again, ein again. We then have the article to. Notice the grave accent, to. We then have the consonant phi, or phi, as it's called in modern English, phi, which is pronounced like the English F or PH, as in phone. We then have an omega with the circumflex accent above it, so we're going to rise and fall in pitch, and a final sigma. Phos, phos, phos. Listen to the rise and fall. Phos, phos. We then have the article tau, omega, nu, with the circumflex accent, so that's tone, tone, tone. And then this long word here, we have the alpha with no aspiration, so just a. We then have the nu. We then have theta, pronounced like th, so anth. We then have the ro, anthro, anthro. See the acute accent, anthro, pon, anthro, pon. So verse 4 is en auto zoe ein, kai he zoe ein, tophos ton anthropon. And verse 5, we have kai, to, phos, again, en, te. We have the eta with iota subscript and a circumflex accent, te. We then have the sigma, as I mentioned before, the initial sigma, followed by kappa, omicron, tau, iota with an acute accent, and an alpha with the iota subscript. So skotia, skotia. We then have the Greek phi again. We have the diphthong alpha iota with an acute accent, so phi, phi. And we have the nu epsilon iota, ne. Epsilon iota is another diphthong. Ne, phi, ne, phi, ne. So we've got 4 vowels in that word, but only 2 syllables because we have 2 diphthongs. Phi, ne. We then have the conjunction kai again, and the article he, and the noun skotia, which we've already seen. Here we have the diphthong alpha upsilon, which is pronounced au. There's no aspiration. Au, auto. We then have the adverb, which is a diphthong u. That's something to remember. The omicron upsilon diphthong is pronounced u. And this last word here, kappa, alpha, tau, epsilon with an acute accent, lambda, alpha, beta, epsilon, nu. Katelaben, katelaben. So verse 5 reads, kai tophos en te skotia phaine, kai he skotia auto u katelaben. So that's a walk through all the details of verses 1 through 5. Let's go ahead now and look at the translation. So verse 1, let's read the verse together, and then we'll look at the exposition of each word and then put it back together for translation. This first verse reads, En arche ein hologos, kai hologos ein proston theon, kai theos ein hologos. The first word en is a preposition. It's followed by the dative case in this use. So we're going to look for the dative case, and we're going to find it in that next word, the noun arche. But this preposition is translated in. If you look in the parentheses after the English in italics, that's the Latin equivalent for this Greek word. So if you've already studied Latin, it'll be helpful to look at the Latin equivalents. So this first word is the preposition en, and it means in. The second word is the noun arche, and it's in the dative case, so it follows that preposition. Arche means beginning, in beginning. Ein is the verb was. Ein, was. In the beginning was. And you notice I added the word the in English translation. You're free to do that in translation, but when you write it in English, you should put it in parentheses to remind yourself that it's not present in the Greek. So, en arche ein, in the beginning was, ho logos. Ho is the definite article. It means the or the. Logos means word. Now, logos is a very complicated vocabulary item, so don't think it means word in some simple sense. This is philosophical language, and what I recommend you do with a word like logos is get a reliable Greek dictionary. You can see I've got an old copy of the Liddell and Scott School Greek Lexicon. You can get this for free on archive.org. But look up a word like logos in the dictionary, and you'll see that there's a lengthy list of possible meanings in English, and you just need to read through all of them to become familiar with the general, the range of meaning for the Greek word. But logos is translated word, but don't think of that in a simple way as like a word on a page. There's a lot more meaning packed into that word logos, which is unfolded philosophically, and which is what St. John is doing here in this opening passage. So we have en arche ein ho logos. In the beginning was the Word. Kai is a conjunction that means and. You'll see it all the time. It just means and. Kai. En arche ein ho logos. In the beginning was the Word. Kai, the conjunction, and ho logos, the Word. Ein was. Pros ton theon. We have a prepositional phrase. Pros ton theon. Pros is a preposition. It means with, and again, you'll see these prepositions, they have a range of meaning, and the only way that you can determine how they should be translated is by the context, and you'll learn that with experience over time. But here in this first verse, the preposition pros in this context is translated with, and it's comparable, as you can see, to the Latin preposition apud. So pros, with, ton theon, with God, with God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Now you'll notice that this phrase here, ton theon, could literally be translated the God, with the God. And, to be fair, grammatically, that would be fine. But when we translate, sometimes in English, we may want to add the to our English translation. Other times, just because of the way that we express different ideas, we may leave the article out. So my advice to you in making that decision is to simply look at existing approved Catholic translations and see how things have been translated. But pros ton theon is translated with God. And then we have that last phrase, kai theos ein ho logos, and God was the Word. Kai theos, and God, ein, was ho logos, the Word. Now, if you look in an English translation, you're going to see that it doesn't say, and God was the Word. It's going to say, and the Word was God. So those nouns are going to be reversed in the English translation. The reason why is because in this sentence, if you read the whole sentence, the subject of the sentence is logos. and in English, we put the subject before the verb. So when we translate that phrase, theos ein ho logos, we flip logos and theos so that the subject comes first. And we know that logos is the subject because of the context of the rest of that verse. So verse 1, en arche ein ho logos, kai ho logos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein ho logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word, or the Word was God. So that's verse 1. Moving on to verse 2, we read, hutos ein en archein pros ton theon. Hutos ein en arche pros ton theon. Hutos, and make sure you pay attention to that pronunciation. There's a lot of stuff going on at the beginning of that word. Hutos is the pronoun that means this, just like the English or Latin hoc. Hutos, this person or thing. And hutos is masculine and singular, so it refers back to the subject of verse 1, which was logos. This, or the same, ein was, en arche, in the beginning, pros ton theon, with God. So most of that content of verse 2 is repeated from verse 1. The only new word there is hutos, which means this. This was in the beginning with God. Hutos. Verse 3. Panta di autou egeneto, kai choris autou egeneto, ude hen ho gegonen. Panta is an adjective that means everything or all things. It's equivalent to Latin omnia, so everything or all things. Panta. This is where we get the word pantheon from. Pantheon, all the gods. Panta, everything or all things. All things, and then we have the abbreviated preposition dia, abbreviated as di, and that means through, and it's always followed by a genitive here. Di autou means through him, all things, panta, di autou, through him, egeneto is made. Now, you'll hear that I translated panta as all things, which is true, but when we look at this verb, egeneto, we can see that this is a singular verb. You can see that by the translation here, is made. So when we see egeneto, is made, it's better for us to translate panta as everything rather than all things, because everything has, it's what we would call a collective noun or a collective adjective noun. And because it's collective, that means it's thought of as a multitude rather than as a bunch of individual things. And it's spoken of as a single multitude, a collective name. That's why we see the singular verb. Okay, so everything is made di autou, through him. We then have the conjunction kai again, which means and the preposition choris, which means without. After choris, if you look up at the verse in verse 3, you'll see we have panta di autou egeneto kai choris autou. You'll see autou is repeated here. Sometimes I leave it off the list just because we've already covered it. You can see we already looked at autou here after di, and it means the same thing. It means him. So kai choris autou. Choris means without, and autou means him. Choris autou, without him. We then see egeneto, again, which means is made. Egeneto. Then we have ude. Ude means not, and this is a formatting mistake. This we have the word hen here, which should be down on another line. It should be another bulleted vocabulary item, but I'll fix that in the printed lesson, but just pay attention to that here. Ude means not. Hen is the Greek word for one. So ude hen means not one thing. Without him, egeneto is made ude hen, not one thing. Then we see this word ho, ho, which looks like the article we saw earlier in ho logos. But if you pay careful attention, you'll see that ho here in verse 1 has no accent mark. And down here in verse 3, we see an accent mark on it. This is actually the pronoun, which is translated which. So, korisautu, without him, egeneto is made ude hen, not one thing, ho, which, gegonen. And you see gegonen is translated has been made or was made. Egeneto and gegonen come from the same verb, but they're different forms. So in Greek grammar, you'll eventually study all of the different verb forms and will understand where those translations come from. So verse 3, Panta di autu egeneto, kai koris autu egeneto, ude hen ho gegonen. Everything through him is made, and without him is made not one thing which has been made. That's verse 3. On to verse 4. En auto zoe ein, kai he zoe ein, tophos ton anthropon. En auto, en means in. We've seen that a couple of times already. En auto, auto means him. En auto, in him. Next we have this noun zoe, which means life. So just think, if you think of a zoologist, is one who studies living things. That living things, which is where the word zoo comes from this Greek word zoe, this Greek noun, zoe. In him, zoe, ein. In him, life was. In him, life was. Kai, and. Hezoe, hezoe, the life. Ein was. To, the. Phos, light. So here we have another important Greek vocabulary item, the noun phos, which means light. You'll recognize that word phos in the element phosphorus, phosphoros. So that means light, phos. We'll also see that another form or other forms of this noun would be photos, photos, which is where we get the word photo from in English. It means light. Photography, photography, means writing or drawing with light on film, photography. But that Greek word phos means light. So en auto, in him, zoe ein, life was, kai he zoe, and the life, ein, was, tophos, the light, ton anthropon, ton anthropon. Anthropon means of men, and in English we don't translate this article ton. In him life was, and the life was the light of men. Ton anthropon. Verse 4. Lastly, verse 5. Kai tophos en te scotia faine, kai he scotia auto u katelaben. Katelaben. We have the conjunction again, kai and tophos. Again, we just saw that in the last verse. Tophos, the light. En, we know that means in. We've already seen that a few times. Kai tophos en te scotia. Te means the, and scotia means darkness. Kai to phos en te scotia, and the light in the darkness phine. Phine. Phine means shines. And the light in the darkness shines. Phine. Kai he scotia, and the darkness, auto. Auto here is translated it, because it's neuter. Auto, it, u. U is the adverb that's translated not. Not katelaben. Katelaben, did comprehend. Kai to phos, and the light, en te scotia, in the darkness, phine, shines. Kai he scotia, and the darkness, auto, it, u, not, katelaben, did comprehend. So that's the exposition of verses 1 through 5. And then down at the bottom of the page here, I think I put a literal translation just based on that exposition. One thing I always encourage students to do is to look at an approved Catholic English Bible translation and compare it to this word-by-word grammatical translation. Normally, modern translations won't stick to the word-by-word translation because it can be a little clumsy for modern readers. But since we're studying the Greek language here, we will stick to a strict word-by-word translation. And I really want students to be accountable to every single word they come to be able to translate it immediately, rather than guessing at phrases or guessing at ideas. That's not good practice. So in a Greek reading course or in a grammar course, we expect students to give us a word-by-word translation. And it's good to compare that word-by-word literal grammatical translation to an approved modern English translation, which is meant to be a little easier to read. So that's a good exercise for you to study the translation. But we've read verses 1 through 5. We've discussed all of the pronunciation of the words there in verses 1 through 5. We then read through each verse one by one and looked at the meanings of all of the words individually. So we cover all the vocabulary. We went through the translation of each verse and each word. I made a few notes here and there on some of the details of these words, but many of these things we'll see them again and again as we continue reading. There's a lot of vocabulary in this first lesson, and there's no easy way around it. You've got to do some memory work, but know that it's time well spent, because we'll see these words again in future lessons, and as you build your vocabulary, it'll enable you to read the Greek more and more quickly as we go along. If after watching this you have any questions about anything in the translation, any of the words, pronunciation, anything that comes up, feel free to contact me. But I think that we've covered everything, and I've moved quickly through this content because this is a video. It's not a live class, and in a video you can always go back, review, watch parts over again, or watch the whole thing over again. So I move a little more quickly than I would in a classroom because you have the ability to back up and review. So watch this video as many times as you need to. Replay parts that you find difficult until you've got them mastered. Do your translation exercises, translating from Greek into English and from English into Greek, just as we did in Latin. And after a while, getting used to the alphabet and the new vocabulary, you'll find this just as easy as Latin translation proved to be over time. So get started, be patient, and ask for help if you need it. I hope that's helpful for the translation of the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 in Greek. God bless your studies.